Hi, everybody. Nice to be back here. So I'm going to do this talk where I'm going kind of far back in my history. I have one way of working that went on for a while, and then a few years ago had kind of a breakthrough, and the work changed quite a bit. So I'm gonna show you the older work, starting with this piece from 1995. This was one of the first sculptures that I made that I considered was you know, like kind of exemplifying a direction that I wanted to take. And at that time, I had gone from being a painter to making kind of three-dimensional paintings that involved three-dimensional materials, and then started making things that ended up on the floor. So this was around just about, you know, like 7 years or so after I had left school, and I had made a number of rules for myself, which involved using materials that would be very hands-on and non-toxic, things that I could do by myself in my studio and not have to worry about fabrication costs, and everything would be cheap and easy to do. Just, you know, I wanted to make it so that it would be a sustainable endeavor. So I kind of hit on the material of beeswax and kind of fell in love with it, and began making works that consisted of an armature that was made from paper mache and lots of kind of like garbagey kind of things, sometimes metal and wood. And then everything would get coated and sealed with the beeswax. So the beeswax would be painted on and then also sculpted on. So all the detail that you see in the form is this kind of technique that I developed sort of just by trial and error, of melting the beeswax and then using it as it cooled off in a kind of clay consistency, and then using it to sculpt the details of the form. So I was interested in taking forms that were recognizable from real life and from the world, rather, and showing them in a way that would appear that you were looking through the world looking at the world through a kind of distortion lens. So even though the object would be recognizable, it would be transformed in some way. And it was all kind of about the surface and not so much what was inside the object. In this cheese form, there was actually mold buried inside the object that I was experimenting with, but then everything gets kind of sealed up with the beeswax. And I was interested in these forms that were suggestive of wormhole spaces, spaces that would be worlds within worlds. In this next piece, which is from 1996, I did a whole series of bread slices. So these are largish, about 5 feet tall. The previous one, the giant cheese, was about 5 feet long or so. So the scale was very kind of human sized. And so the same thing with the bread. It was the details were what was very important to me, not just the whole image. Every pore on the bread was kind of like an entrance way into another world. So they were very labor-intensive pieces. They took a long time to make. I used to have to wait for a couple of hours for the wax to melt in a double boiler before I could use it. And I went from, I made a number of different objects that were done in series. So the bread pieces were part of a whole group of crumbs and slices that were installed in a room together. And then I did some other works with the like giant mushrooms, like this one in the front here was part of a whole series of mushrooms, started in like 1999 to 2002, giant mushrooms and cactuses. And the forms were kind of anthropomorphic, like they would allude to parts of the body. The beeswax was kind of like a skin. So this is now from around 2006, this group of cactuses that were partially inspired by a trip to Joshua Tree. And I kind of thought of them as family units, like they were groups of you know, like friends and family. I was also interested in the idea of making a disagreeable object, to borrow the Giacometti name of a couple of sculptures that he did. Would be an object that was both repulsive and seductive at the same time, and was very confrontational to the viewer. In this body of work, this is the last group now of beeswax pieces. So this is from 2008. In this group, I was kind of obsessing over eyeballs a bit. I think maybe going back to some high school obsession. But the idea of the eyeball being a kind of an entranceway, an entrance, and also a receiver. So the sculptures were looking back at you. And during this body of work, when I was making this work, I was kind of going through a lot of changes personally. And I think that was a lot of the anxiety from that was reflective in these pieces. For example, this is like the embodiment of anxiety. I had a kid a couple of years before this, and so there was, I think, a lot of like just big life changes that were affecting me, and also making me feel kind of trapped in what I was doing art-wise. Time had become a huge problem, how to find time. And the sculptures were very time-consuming, the process of making them. So I started to feel at this time, even while I was making this work, that that I needed to kind of break out of this way of working, or the whole thing was just going to kind of come to a sad end because it wasn't possible to have that kind of labor going on. The other issue was that I was starting to have a lot of ideas about other possibilities of forms, and I realized that my thought process, thinking about these ideas, was happening much more quickly than I could execute anything. And that was really a major weight on my back. Like I felt like this was, you know, my thoughts were always racing ahead of what I could actually accomplish. So I started to try to think about, began at this time to think about other ways to incorporate other materials. In this piece, I began taking the beeswax off of the piece. So the whole thing was painted with beeswax, and then I kind of attacked it and to remove the wax. And that was really just one of the first pieces that I attempted to break from that as a material. So this piece is probably the largest of the beeswax pieces. It's about 7 feet tall on the pedestal, and it's called Portal. So you know, it took me like, I actually worked on this for several years. And you know, the idea of the wormhole, the portal, was something that I was interested in all along, and it's funny to me, like, to see how my work has changed a lot from the materials, but a lot of the same interests are still there. You know, the spiral and the eye that looks back at you. So between this period and the next slide is about 2 years, between 2008 and 2010, where I was working to change my work. And it was a very slow-going process where I would go to my studio. It was kind of like being in a bad relationship where you're addicted to these materials that are not really helping you at all, but you can't stop using them. So it really was a relationship that I had with this beeswax that I was like, you know, so dependent on. And I would go to my studio and I would make these forms out of paper mache and metal, and then I would attempt to not paint them with the wax. So they would sit around my studio, and many of them did get painted because I would just be like, I have to seal that thing up, it just doesn't look right. And this went on for quite a long time. There are a lot of there's a lot of work I'm not showing you here that's you know, transitional. And then there was finally one day where I made this form, and I just was so very deliberately disciplined about it. I just told myself, this piece you are not allowed to go near with beeswax. So I made the form, and I just let it sit there, and I would come to my studio, and I would sit in a chair, and I would stare at the piece for really long periods of time, and it just looked like crap to me, like it was just unacceptable. But this weird thing happened where over a period of like several months, it was almost like an overnight thing. Like it was this daily exposure to this form, and not really doing much of anything else, I have to say, because at that point I was just like, I couldn't even use the wax anymore. Finally, one day I came to the studio and I looked at this thing and I thought, this is the piece, this is it, it's done. Like this is what I'm going to live with. And it was almost like finally something just kind of snapped in my brain and turned into another direction. And after that, it all came very, very easily. It was like this breakthrough had happened finally. Took its natural course, and then everything after that was just like pouring out. So I began to form new relationships with materials, and I started with the materials that had been there all along underneath the beeswax, which was this metal lath stuff that's used in walls, you know, with the plaster, and paper mache and sometimes plaster, and then other materials started to creep into the work. So I realized that at this point I can bring anything into my world. You know, I would just have to like kind of cultivate a relationship with every new material that I brought in. So I started using modeling clay, where you see the colors. That's actually clay, which I just really love those colors and the fact that they're a little three-dimensional. And then old test pieces that had been laying around my studio for literally years, like this black form that's hanging, and all kinds of like, like this was also a test piece. Cat litter. The little pebbles are actually cat litter that I happen to have a bag of in my studio, and I found out later it's made of clay. And slowly this whole new language began to emerge, and it was almost like, I felt like I was going from a dictionary that contained 10 words to a dictionary that contained an infinite number of words. Like the possibilities suddenly were like just, you know, making me really excited. And I have to say, like, I think a lot of the ways that, one of the inspirations to this way of working came from bringing my kid to the studio a little more than I had wanted to, you know. And I'd bring him to the studio and I'd be a little irritated that he's there, you know, you better listen. I would be trying to think of what he could do while he's there, you know. I'd just like, I'd be constantly like scolding him to just leave me alone, I'm trying to work here, do your own thing, you know. And he would be off in some corner, and he'd start like, just making stuff out of crap in my studio. And I would be in the other corner kind of sweating it out and feeling anxiety, you know, just frustration. And then within like 10 minutes, I've looked over to his corner and he's made this amazing thing that, you know, just like that, you know. And it was so easy for him, you know. And then I would occasionally be like, do you think I could maybe borrow that little thing that you made? You know, I really like it. So I would, at times, I found myself actually stealing from my child, you know, which is not the worst thing you can do. But like the pebbles on this piece here that are shaped with the glue, like that was totally from watching him take the aquarium rocks and pour glue and then make these flat blobs. And so I started to actually do that. There are all kinds of details that you know, like this other thing that he kind of invented was this, he would pour paint onto a surface and then drop rocks into it. And I saw him do that one day and I was like, wow, that's cool. And so this piece is called High on a Mountain, which is actually the name of an old banjo song, old-time song. So I began to work in a much more improvisational manner, and it was very, very satisfying. I could make work very quickly, and also I could change things very quickly, and it was something very liberating about working in this very intuitively driven way. And the meanings of like I didn't worry myself about meaning and content the way that I had used to with my previous body of work, because I felt like it was all kind of coming out of the process of making the work, and that the sculptures themselves would start to tell me their meanings, their ideas, or it was a much more satisfying way of working than I had ever worked, and I could feel the energy from it was something that I definitely had never experienced before. So it's kind of like, you know, like the first time you fall in love, in a way, like you realize that you weren't in love ever before. And I started to use parts of old sculptures, like this. There's a cactus there at the bottom of this piece that had been from the series of cactuses that I had done. And one of the things that I became especially interested in was to find a way of making a sculpture where it doesn't feel fully balanced, like where there's this sense of the possibility of failure, so that you feel that you're looking at a thing that is maybe on the verge of just like not working at all, you know? So it was important to me to not make something that was just beautifully balanced, and I felt like it had to have an edge to it. And so the materials that I was using and the way that I was working was, I felt like for the first time it was really I was able to get to that kind of tenuous place that I enjoy being in. So a lot of the imagery is related to things that I'd been interested in earlier, like the micro worlds and micro versus macro. So like in a piece like this, which is titled Synapse, I felt like I keep doing that with my hand gestures. I felt like I was both alluding to a micro space and then also a solar system at the same time. So so you would have this kind of push and pull of scale when you looked at it. And that's something that goes back to the earlier beeswax pieces, this idea of scale and being pulled in and out of scale. So this group is from 2012, and I started to get increasingly more into titling things, like the shows, and also the individual sculptures are all titled. So this show is called Lost Songs of the Filament. So it was meant to sound kind of like the name of an album, like Lost Songs of the Philippines. And it was also, one thing that I forgot to mention is that I started playing music with people, doing collaborative music projects with various artist friends of mine who also have this music interest. And I think that a lot of that was starting to come into the work as well, especially the improvisational stuff that was happening in the sculpture was I think a lot of the ability to be flexible with that was coming from pushing this other discipline, music, which I never thought of as being related to anything in my life, and then all of a sudden it was like becoming more important than the art in a way. Like it was, so it was happening simultaneously, and I started thinking about the sculptures themselves as having kind of a musical presence that you know, almost like a synesthesic kind of experience, where the little rods are vibrating and have a sound that emanates that becomes a kind of invisible wave, you know? I mean, these are just kind of the thoughts that go through my head when I'm making this work. You know, I'm actually sitting there pondering the idea of like energy waves coming out of the pieces. I mean, it sounds, it's kind of, I know that it's kind of hokey, like it's kind of absurd, but to me, like that's what, like I'm always looking for that as an indicator of the presence of the piece. So this piece is called Cloudminder, and I forgot to tell you This one is called Let Me Love Your Brain. And the other, I mentioned before that I began recycling older works. And this chicken bone that sits here is from a series that I did in 1997 of giant chicken bones that were made of plaster over armature. And I had these giant chicken bones in my studio all this time, just sitting there, totally unwrapped. And at this point, I had only recycled small elements of past sculpture, and then finally, one day I was looking at these bones, and I had always really loved these sculptures, and I was like, well, maybe it's time to start recycling these giant things that I've been storing for 15 years. And it was actually really fun because I got to kind of give a new life to this piece that I really loved, and I felt like they were in my studio in a very kind of neglected state, and this was a way to like put them on a stage again, so I have another piece that's a chicken bone called Transmissions of the Threadbare. So the chicken bone part is about 6 feet tall, to give you a sense of the scale. And the materials, I began to work with this more and more with these steel rods and the amoeba shape that I found that I could make by connecting all the steel rods. So a lot of the things that happen in these works, they happen because the material is kind of lending itself to going into a certain direction. Like the pipe fixtures, I realized that I could use them in all these as connectors to make larger works. And this is just a detail in the back of this piece. It's a slice of an old orange. This one is called God's Eye with a Z, like Godzilla. I started using this plastic yarn, like the kind that you make bracelets from in arts and crafts summer camp, and also the wool yarn, mainly as an antidote to working with all that sharp metal. I needed something soft, and the yarn kind of lended itself to working very easily with your hands. This one is called Once Upon a Time, The End. And it has a big rock in it that I found on the street and lugged back to my studio. And I was wrestling with this piece of metal, and it wouldn't stand up, and so the rock was nearby, plopped the rock on it to use as a weight, and then that ended up being incorporated in there. This one is called Oracle in Reverse, and it has all these little threads. I don't know if you can see it, but it's probably the most musical looking one, I guess, maybe because of the threads. They look kind of like an instrument. So this was, I think, from all that group, this is the largest one. It's called The Collector. It's about 9 feet tall. And I worked on this one for quite a long time, and I was going to show you just a whole, I would work on it and I would document as I work. So I'm going to show you a whole series of slides that take you through the process of what this piece went through till it finally got to this stage. Because of the way that I'm working, sometimes it's very hard to say when to stop working, when is a piece done. And so, like for this piece, I started with these milk crates that I covered in plaster, and that was actually a separate element. And then separately from that, I had made this big giant metal blob that I began wrapping with the plastic lace. And so I started just playing around with those different forms, and pretty much at every stage that you see of this, I would do this, and I would think, well, it might be done. And then I would leave it and come back the next day and be like, nah, that's terrible. Or, you know, or just, sometimes it would take a couple of days. But it was kind of this thing that just keep working on it and working on it. And at times it would be very frustrating because it wouldn't look like anything. And then at times it would be picture worthy, so I would snap a photo. And then it starts to get a little more organized, and then I'm like, no, it's too organized. A photograph ended up there. And then finally, slowly to the end. So they take quite a bit of time. Sometimes, you know, like a piece this size might go through a lot of different changes. But somehow it was, like I always have an ability with these pieces to work on many at the same time. And things happen by accident, you know, like masking tape that was placed to hold pieces of metal actually ends up staying in there. I'm going to show you a number of smaller pieces. This one is called Important Meteorites, which was actually a headline I saw in the New York Times for an ad, an auction for meteorites. This is incorporating a crumb of bread from an older work. So I like working with the small ones sometimes, also because I can imagine them being very large as well, you know. So there are sometimes studies for things that I end up doing bigger, though not exactly looking like that, but elements that I take and into the larger pieces. Like with this piece, I have a lot of old food things that lay around my studio and dry out. And one of the things was a whole series of mushrooms that I had used as models for the beeswax mushrooms that I had done late I was going to say late 1900s, but I mean like 1999, 2000, whatever. So I had these mushrooms, and they were really old. I mean, they were from that time, so they were like, you know, 14, 15 years old, and they had dried up, and then they had reached a point where they weren't going to get any smaller, and then they just kind of stay, and they look the same for years and years. So I stuck this guy in there. And that kind of gave me the idea for this piece that I'm going to show you that I did more recently. This one is called Ignatz Syndrome, which comes from a reference to Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat is the cat, and Ignatz is the mouse. And Ignatz is always throwing a brick at Crazy Cat's head as a show of love. And little hearts come out of his head. Another Ignatz syndrome. That's actually a piece of driftwood that's got paper mache on it and plastilina. So I had a show up in Albany, SUNY Albany, in the museum there, and was given the opportunity to do something in a much larger space. So even though I have a studio that's the size of a corner of this of this space here, I made this for that specifically for that venue because I needed to expand. So it was about 13 feet in length, and I could make it in parts, which was great. And when I had it installed in my studio, I didn't install it the full length. I just installed it like 10 feet instead of 13, so it's smaller. But in any case, it's called self-reflexive. What is it called again? So I'm blanking out on my own title. My God, narcissistic self-reflexive supernova. It's a long title, and it's got this mushroom, this giant mushroom that is a repurposed piece from 2002. So the mushroom part you saw in an earlier slide is about 5 feet in diameter. And then this giant amoeba-shaped thing, which is made of steel rods that are connected by couplings and have all the yarns and the plastic yarn woven all throughout it. And then there's a screw on the back of the mushroom cap where all these little threads and yarns are attached, and hanging from that are the dried mushrooms, which I now realize, you can keep these things forever. Oops. So you can see, oh, I should have showed that slide. Oh well. You can see the bird's eye view. So the idea kind of was that this mushroom is projecting its image into space. And that's kind of where it became a narcissist, I guess, and in need of therapy. But it's projecting into space and attached to the amoeba, which has these pores in it that seem like things are going through the pores. So this is the other side held up. All these kind of meanings started coming out while I was working on it. I mean, the pairing of these elements and the stuff hanging from it really were ideas that I didn't have like a sketch where I had this big idea and then sketched it out and execute it. It was done like all the other work in this very kind of improvisational way where I would just try different things. And the meanings start to come out of this process. And then around this time, I was also watching every single Star Trek episode that had ever, from the early years, the first Star Treks, which hopefully all of you have seen. I was trying to get my kid, I was like, this is what I grew up on. And he loved it. So we watched every single episode together, and there's this one episode called The Immunity Syndrome, where there's this 11-mile wide amoeba floating in space, and the Enterprise is heading for it, and the amoeba is sucking all the energy out of the space, out of space, including the Enterprise, and they have to send Spock into the nucleus to blow it up. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end, but I remember one time I was trying to remember the title of the episode, and I looked it up online and came across this website where this guy had reviewed every single Star Trek episode and given it, different ratings. And this episode scored really low because the reviewer felt that it wasn't scientifically possible for an 11-mile wide amoeba to sustain itself in space. So therefore, it got a thumbs down rating, which is funny because, to me, that's the whole reason why that episode is so good, because the absurdity. So I was working on this piece when I saw that and was and I feel like it kind of fueled a lot of the ideas that came out of the piece were partially ended up being influenced by watching that Star Trek episode. So the back was kind of this collage of materials that end up being also reflected in the amoeba shape. So every material here is used in some other way on the amoeba part, so they kind of reflect each other, except for the hamster. And the hamster was kind of a reference to the spinning wheel. I titled the show up there Antecedents of the Astral Hamster, in reference to this, the escape from the cage into astral space. So this piece is called Cryptanalysis of the Enigma, and it's about 11.5 feet tall. The Enigma was actually this secret code machine that the Nazis used in World War II, and the cryptanalysis of the Enigma was this the breaking of the code that helped to win the war for the Allies. But I used the title just because I really liked the way it sounded, Cryptanalysis of the Enigma. And also because the piece is like a giant antenna that seems to be transmitting and receiving information, which is what a lot of these works kind of end up alluding to. The energy forces that I was talking about earlier. And just some close-ups of so I also did an installation of these drawings in Albany. It's called Facsimile Wall. And this started out as an idea for a book that was going to consist of the little sketches that I collect in my the Moleskine sketchbooks, which are about this big. And I had this idea to make to make a book. I was hoping to make a book of that, but the book didn't pan out. But while I was working on this idea, I was Xeroxing pages from the notebooks and tacking them all over my studio wall. And I started to feel like the group itself was actually becoming more interesting to me than doing a book. Because in this way I could see connections between things, and that became much more interesting, having a spread out kind of view. So I did another version of that wall more recently in this show that I just did at Derek Eller a few weeks ago, and titled it Spaghetti Love. So it's a lot of the previous drawings and pages, but also including not just Xeroxes, but actual drawings that I took out of the books. So, and it's also, both examples include also Xeroxes from books that I was using as source material and references, and printouts from the internet, and also like movie stills and things like that, and then also photographs that I took myself. And the pages, I mean, these books are things that I carry around with me everywhere, and I work on them in the park or on the subway. A lot of work gets done in the subway, I have to tell you. The subway is like, I feel it's like it's my office sometimes. And they consist of everything from ideas for sculptures, so like little doodles and of possible sculptural forms, and then also sketches of sculptures that I've already made, and then also just ephemera from everyday life, like shopping lists and names of songs, titles of names of bands. That was a lot of pages of that. Appointments, everything would go into these books, and so they're kind of like exposing my diary, you know, to the world. And it's like also stuff that I kept thinking, like, why would anyone in a million years be interested in any of this? But somehow to me it kind of made sense, because it was a way for me to like look at my sources and my ideas alongside just everyday ordinary life, you know, and seeing that there really isn't really much of a separation between the two, you know. So I'm showing you close-ups of the version up in Albany. So it's about, the version that I just did is about 320 pages or so. Right. So there's images from biology books and books on minerals. There's the Enterprise going through the amoeba. Space photos that I didn't take. And then also drawings that my kid made that, you know, an occasion would grab my book from me and start drawing in there. And the thing is, like, I never intended to ever Xerox and hang and show any of these pages to anyone. So everything that's in there was done without any kind of thought to showing this drawing. So there's a kind of freedom in that, you know, like we all have these kinds of books, and you put anything you want in there. And then one day I end up hanging it on the wall, and it sort of changes my relationship to these books now. So the version that I did most recently included a lot of pages that I worked on and purposely didn't put anything on the back, with the idea that they may be added to this group. And I kind of feel like it's not quite the same anymore. It sort of changes the way that you approach the page. It does, like knowing that you're going to put it in an exhibit really changes how you work, and it's not always for the better. So I'm going to see, I mean, I had this idea to continue this project, just keep going with it and going with it. But I don't want to lose that kind of freedom that I had with the books. So I'm now debating how to do that. Like I don't think I will ever again want anyone to see a drawing of a moose necessarily, you know what I mean? So this is just a view of the recent show that I did. So I showed this mushroom piece again. It was pretty minimal, just 3 sculptures and then the wall piece. This piece is called Powers of Tenuous, which is a reference to Powers of 10, a film by Charles and Ray Eames about scale. And it's made, this cube is made of just one single wire, just going round and round. Actually, at one point I ran out of wire, so I had to splice. This piece is called Porous Porous. And I, kind of expanding on the mushroom piece that you saw, in this piece I've included bread that was accumulating in my home. Every other day I have to buy a loaf of bread for the home. And we have this collection of dried bread that accumulates in the closet that's just like falling out of and so I started taking it to my studio to play around with, and ended up painting it, and then it ended up making this piece. Most of it is painted, but then there's also parts that are tied there. So this, is made just in a similar way to all the others. I would start with one form, like in this case I had the foam, the blob of foam was sitting around my studio for years. Like that blob of foam goes back to like, I think 1999 or so, 98. And good thing I never throw anything away. So I started playing with that as kind of the center, and then adding and taking away other materials, other forms. And the bread ended up in these pores. And as I was working on it, I realized that everything I was doing was kind of about the form of the pore. Like the bread has pores, the bread pores that come from the process of baking, where the carbon dioxide is released from the holes. And then the polyurethane foam is all pores. And then the structure, the amoeba structure, is all, has these large holes in it that are pore-like. And so it was like pores within pores within pores. And so that became that ended up being the title of the piece. And this little clay cactus form, which some people have asked me if it's the Statue of Liberty, but it's about this big. So I think this is my, a couple more. Yeah, so just close up. So the bread is painted with different types of paint, mostly acrylic, though there's a lot of also flash paint in the piece, especially on the plaster part. And when I was showing Derek this piece in my studio, the guy that I show with, Derek Eller, he was somewhat concerned about the archivalness of the bread, because that's something that, dealers worry about. And I was, Derek, bread is so archival. It lasts for millions of years, millions. And he was like, oh, really? Oh, okay. But then I was in the Metropolitan Museum pretty recently in the Egyptian wing, and I came across bread, and so I looked it up, and sure enough, hundreds of loaves have been found in the Egyptian tombs that are over 5,000 years old. So I had, of course, I sent Derek this information right away. And so he's attempting to spin that. So that's my last slide. That's a good question, because actually what happened was a couple of years before that breakthrough piece, when I was starting to have the 2-year period of struggling, I had a studio mate, and I had, I begin all my pieces with that metal and the paper mache, and so I had this piece sitting there that was just metal and paper mache. It was white, and my studio mate came in that day and he was like, "That looks so good. Why didn't you ever leave them like that?" And I was like irritated and just like, "Shut up." But that stuck in my head, and it is one of those annoying things that used to happen, where people would come to my studio and be like, I'd be showing them the finished beeswax pieces, and then they'd look over at some like scruffy piece of garbage on the side and they'd like, "Why do you do that?" So. but those kinds of things stuck. It's definitely stuck in my head. But the piece itself that I showed you, I didn't show to anyone until I had already had the breakthrough with it. I think what happened was, even though the dictionary expanded, I still was pretty slow with every material that I introduced, because I don't feel like I can just grab things at random so much. Like I feel like I develop relationships. Like I'm attracted to a material, like a particular type of wire, and then I'll see if I can develop a relationship with it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So if the relationship works, then the piece becomes part of the lexicon. But not everything worked, So, but because of the way that the manner in which the process that I'm using, I try things and I take them away. So it's this constant give and take. Yeah, I have to move this piece. I had to remove every single piece of bread from there and pack them separately, and then and also the whole amoeba thing. That's not an amoeba, but the whole wire structure with the yarn had to be packed separately as well. So I make them so that they come apart. So that piece has like the two ends of the rods. They go into these little tubes that are in the base, and so it can be pulled out of the base, and then all the bread gets taken off. The wire gets unraveled or whatever. Cool. So they take a while to put together. Yeah, like once they're in their final form, I've been trying to recreate them every time they get moved. But then they're never quite the same. I feel like it's never going to be exact, and I have to kind of let go of that, the anxiety of that. So I'm okay with that. Like especially a lot of the plaster things, like they shed, pieces of plaster fall off all the time, and to a degree I'm okay with things kind of changing in that way. And also, like, the mushrooms could get replaced. Well, let's see. Early on, I was early sculptor heroes or whatever. Eva Hess and Franz West. Lee Bonteque had this retrospective that I saw when it came to Los Angeles years ago that totally blew me away. Like, it was when she first introduced her new body of work to the public. And then that show came to New York, but it wasn't, the installation wasn't as good as the one in LA. Who else? Oh, Paul Tech was an artist that I was very inspired by. And Paul Tech also had a big breakthrough at some point when he stopped using his beeswax, so I think I doubly relate to that. I'm drawing a blank on names, but that's a number. No, I write songs. Yeah. I mean, I do music with friends, and so I write music and songs. Yeah, and I think a lot of the language use has kind of crossed over into the sculptures. Like, especially now with the way that I'm working, like everything has to have a title. Like I have to. It becomes part of the process of making the piece, is coming up with a title. And I think that might be from music. Hmm? No, you don't want to do that. No. Actually, don't have anything out there really. Guitar. Yeah, so I started playing acoustic guitar about 10 years ago. I'd never had any interest in it before. And then a friend of mine was playing a lot when we would get together, having dinner or whatever. He would take his guitar out and start singing and playing old-time music. Old-time music, in case you don't know, is music made before 1930s, early American. Some of it goes to 19th century, and bluegrass and this kind of folk stuff. And so I became interested in singing the songs with him, and then I had no way of singing them when I was alone, so I took up the guitar and taught myself to play. But now I play electric guitar mostly, and I don't, the music is very different, so. Yeah. Well, originally there was no supporting bar. And then as I started putting the bread up there, it got heavier and heavier. And the whole thing just collapsed on my head while I was working. And so I realized it wasn't going to work out, you know, the way I had originally intended it. So I was at first, a little upset about that, because it ruined my idea of what this piece had become, you know. But then I started to kind of play around with, first, how to get it to stand temporarily, you know. And so I had this pipe, which is something I use often, is the pipe. And then looking at it, I started to kind of like how it needed this crutch, you know, and it became like kind of like this dependent on the crutch for support, you know. And so I started to see the humor in it, like to see how this pathetic thing that can't stand on its own, you know, like I could, and so then I started liking it. So I decided that instead of remaking this form with a stronger support, that the way to go was to have this crutch, which is like a foot, I guess.